That was a real nice debugging experience in some ways.
Yeah, and I think we're just getting back to that now.
Bring back Dreamweaver.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Off Script by Hey Radio. I'm James and I run an agency called Parallax.
And I'm Josh and I run a consultancy called Stac.
And today we're going to be talking about application performance. Josh, when you're working on application performance, what would your first step be?
I think it would be to baseline where you are. So you need to get a good feeling for where you're at. You need to get that baseline to understand, your application's general performance, some of the things that you can improve before starting any further. I think you need to know where your starting point is.
Yeah, that makes sense. We use tools like New Relic, which is really good.
Yep.
And they have lots of different agents for .NET, Ruby, PHP, JavaScript.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the more mature long-standing tools.
It is. They went a bit nuts with their pricing a while ago, but I think they've brought it back now with the New Relic one. It's a bit more sane.
Yeah.
So you can run it on serverless, and it makes sense cost wise.
Because they really went full enterprise, didn't they? They went crazy.
It was per virtual CPU style pricing, and when you have lots of hosts, they were like,
especially at a period where auto scaling and everything was rather popular. It wasn't ideal especially for startups that were trying to be a bit leaner.
Yeah, that's it. There are some alternatives. Atatus are pretty good. They're not as well known, but they have a similar sort of setup. And on the PHP side, we think Blackfire.io is absolute magic.
Right.
So you have a little browser plugin, and you can visit the page in your application. So you might be logged in.
On like localhost or
either on localhost, or we have it running in QA as well.
Right.
And you can get into a certain part of your application. So you could be partway through a checkout flow or something like that.
Okay.
You hit the button and it will run that same request multiple times, assuming you want to get requests, for example.
Right.
And then it'll use that to get a good baseline of where stuff's at. You can either view it as a timeline, or you can drill down into a tree of time spent. And then you just sort of use that to identify where all your issues are. And
does that pick up the application state? So if you're logged in, does it use all the session states and everything?
Yeah, that's it. So you're not hitting a logged out.
That's cool.
Thing. Because usually you get your performance problems when you're logged in. You're logged out, hopefully you're caching everything.
Yeah.
You're just marketing pages, pricing pages. It's not the guts of your app.
Yeah.
But yeah, it definitely would recommend that alongside New Relic, because New Relic's more about monitoring what's actually happening in production, whereas Blackfire is like, I'm debugging this now locally and I need to actually see what's going on.
So how does that work in terms, because a lot of we'll cover front end, back end performance things. We'll cover the whole kind of stack, but a lot of the problems with performance, or some of the problems with the performance, come around specific edge cases with maybe certain shapes of user, certain types of combinations of data, large amounts of data that aren't maybe paginated properly, things like that, as a very trivial example. But how would you go about recreating that in that kind of Blackfire kind of scenario? You
need to make production like data in your local environment. Ideally through some kind of automated script, or if you can't do that, take the live data, scrub the local. You have to scrub the emails.
Yeah,
you don't want to accidentally email them, or make sure you have like mail trap or something like that. As an extra buffer. But ideally not personal identifiable information on your local laptop.
I think that's a really good starting point for this conversation on application performance, because a lot of the conditions of which you develop locally don't necessarily reproduce what a lot of people experience in production. So that kind of like for like, and how you do that, whether you sanitize data from production or you automate the generation of an entire data set.
Another thing that we sometimes do is on a large IoT platform that we run, we have a sort of QA environment, and we can point our local machines at that RDS instance and that InfluxDB instance, because those you can't really recreate the performance of those services on your local machine, because the data's too big to fit.
Yeah.
It'll fill your laptop full of voltages and data that you don't really want just sat there. It is difficult to evaluate the performance of things like DynamoDB and things like that.
So with that kind of instance where you connect to a remote service, how do you keep the schema in date when maybe many branches and devs are diverging from what that state is?
So we have a YAML file. I know some developers hate YAML, but we have a config option in there where we can have a per branch database.
Oh, nice.
And it'll go and make that based on the migrations folder.
Oh, brilliant.
And you can just turn that on and off per repo. That's a good way to do it. Obviously, you can do that manually if you want, but it gets messy.
There's quite a lot of ways as well to generate that data. So in Ruby and Rails, you've got different factory kind of gems that can basically, you can give it the shape of the data and it'll go away and it'll generate all the emails and passwords and associated records.
Factories and seed is a great way of doing that, definitely. And you could even build a performance test.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of identifying problems, getting it production-like locally somehow is a really good idea.
So you mentioned New Relic. Do you still use New Relic now, or is it kind of mainly Blackfire, or is it a combination of the two? Or
we use New Relic and Aptx in production, and we use various bug monitoring tools depending on the project.
Yeah.
Bugsnag for JavaScript stuff, Flare for Laravel stuff. That will flag a few performance bits, things time out and things like that. But yeah, mainly you're looking in New Relic and Aptx for your application performance monitoring stuff.
And a lot of these hook into, with Ruby, there's AppSignal is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
It started as an exception tracker, but it's got a lot of performance related stuff in it now.
Oh, nice.
But a lot of them hook in quite deep into the runtime of the app and into the actual language itself. So you can start to show the full stack traces and what's going on really quite deep down.
Oh, that's great. And a lot of them will actually pick out the SQL queries that your app's making and make recommendations on indexes that you need to add.
Which is great, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think SQL performance is something that when you're using something like Ruby or Laravel, it's very easy to just knock together a load of models with associations and you get that N+1 problem.
Yeah.
Just sprinkling a little bit of eager loading here and there in the right places will get you quite far. I
guess that's one of the beauties and kind of downfalls of using an ORM, an object relational mapper library, in terms of how it hides a lot of what's going on behind the scenes. It hides a lot of the commands that it's giving to the database. And, definitely in Rails over the last few years, there's a lot of work that's been done to really, make the logs a lot more readable, see what the query is being run. And in particular with eager loading, there's suggestions as part of the ORM libraries to say, you might want to eager load this because you seem to be using this join table a lot, for example.
Yeah. And I think people worry a little bit too much about it sometimes in the initial stages because if you spend your time overly optimizing while you're trying to build out the first version of the app, you're going to waste a lot of time and it might not even succeed. Like your big problem is getting people to use it and then optimizing it.
I guess that's an interesting point though. So there's kind of basic due diligence that you can do as part of building an app. So, we'll get onto Lighthouse and some of the more front end related stuff shortly, but there's basic expectations that we as engineers put on each other. You can easily inspect the front end of an app. You can easily see when it's built, maybe not to the best standards.
Yeah.
But I think there's a different perception with the back end side, which is, you probably don't need to optimize everything to start with. See where your pain points are and react to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
There seems to be kind of two camps of thought there, I think.
And you can also have things like background jobs that run tasks. It's a good practice anyway. Anything that takes longer than 20-30 milliseconds you might consider putting into a background job, especially if you talk to a third-party service like SMTP Relay or resizing an image is an obvious example.
I remember the email one was the first use case that I found. It was because you used to send it in process, and obviously, sometimes it would crap out, and then the whole user journey is ruined. And actually, that can be resolved on a back end job.
Yeah, you don't want. Let's say you've written a really naive implementation where you write something to the database, send them a confirmation email, and then do some other logic.
Yeah.
And the fact that the SMTP flaked out for a second means you sort of got a customer in a halfway, not very nice state, so you haven't used transaction. I mean, you don't need to do all this fancy stuff, but if you just start moving a few bits into jobs, it just goes a lot more smoothly.
I guess the counter argument is the added complexity by decoupling those things, especially when you're doing, as you just said, like a transaction of a few different actions.
Yeah.
Can get funky.
Yeah, definitely. You'd either want them all to happen or not, but with working with distributed tools and systems, it's not always that simple, is it?
No.
I mean, it's just sending an email is the most basic example that you can think of, but I mean, I imagine where you're at the moment, there's many more times
many disparate systems. And I even remember when we built one of the bigger NHS platforms, and it had a big content manager where you chuck a zip file at it and it unpack it and start to add it all to the library.
Yeah.
Lots of different
I think I remember that.
Yeah. I mean, if you do remember it might be because you're slightly wounded by it. But it's obviously many complex steps that all are quite linear in their sequence. You unpack it, you add each item to the database, and you do a few more things. That sort of stuff makes for interesting coding.
Yeah, definitely. And how do you monitor performance of that as well?
Yeah.
So in New Relic and Datatus, you can flag things as background jobs.
Yes.
Which have different. They call it Aptx Criteria. So Aptx is a score that you use to sort of rate how performant your app is.
Yeah.
Like 0.9 and above is good, but it's a really good way of figuring out if your application performance is dipping, and you don't want to include background long-running tasks in that metric because users don't see it, so they don't care. Although you do need to keep an eye on it because someone somewhere might have written some horrible SQL query that's going to fall over at some point.
I think that's a good point though. So it might be a bit outside the scope of the topic for this one, but the developer experience of that is really important. In terms of everyone's had a test suite that's bloated and taken too long, and cost the devs a lot of time.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess application performance also looks at that DevX kind of side of things too.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got like an uncached, like raw version of this running on a slower laptop, and it's slow with production-like data, devs are going to slow down their development. They're not going to have a very nice time. So speeding things up actually speeds up development as well, and
improves the culture. It can even in some more drastic cases reduce attrition and all those sorts of things.
You don't want to wake up and you go back to that application and it's already running inside a VM inside a VM.
The test is still running from last night
because it's Docker for Mac and it's like Inception. If just speeding that up,
we can probably say goodbye to Docker for Mac sponsoring any sort of podcast in the future, I guess, along with NPM.
Maybe they'll figure something out where it runs a bit more bare bones on the M1, but who knows?
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So I guess in terms of that tooling as well, it'd be amiss not to mention, the huge advancements Chrome Devtools have made over the last few years. That is such a powerful part of your arsenal as an engineer now.
Absolutely. I remember back in the day, Joe Hewitt's Firebug, and he used to include a little script tag, and you were in IE and you could open it.
That was a game changer.
It was.
Yeah.
That's where console.log came from.
Yeah.
And that's my early how is this actually working debugging experience. It wasn't just an alert box.
That was a lifeline as well. If you in what was a black box at the time, that was such a lifeline as an engineer or dev just to go, oh my god, I can actually see what's happening.
Yeah, and that was sort of the birth of developer tools in browser, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I know Dreamweaver used to have some rudimentary stuff, and obviously the WYSIWYG thing, but you couldn't really see what was going on in the JS engine.
That was an in IDE browser, wasn't it? So
yeah,
it wasn't really a true representation of what your users were getting.
I think they had some horrible Trident thing where it's sort of IE but with their own bits in it.
It was ahead of its, Dreamweaver in general I think was a bit ahead of its time, but or not ahead of its time, but it definitely defined an era. But I think the way that interacted with the browser was quite ahead of its time. That was a real nice debugging experience in some ways.
Yeah, and I think we're just getting back to that now.
Bring back Dreamweaver,
but in a much nicer way. And yeah, as soon as you could actually add timing commands to, I mean, that was the most basic thing. You could actually do a start and stop, and you do micro time commands and really basic sort of how long did this bit take between this and the callback. That was my first sort of experience in debugging JavaScript. So obviously with JSPDF, which is still ticking along, that had some performance issues quite early on because we were doing really daft stuff in IE6, like where we were trying to create massive binary files in a creaking JavaScript engine. So yeah, that was fun. But these days it's so much nicer with Chrome Devtools. You've got Lighthouse, obviously, which you can run really nicely on your local machine, but I find it quite hit and miss to what score you get, because your machine might be doing something in the background. You've got Xcode open, you're running it on someone else's laptop. You've got your database full of production data. Whereas if you use web.dev, which is Google's online version of that, they run it in a consistent container for you for free, and then you can actually share the results, which is brilliant, right? And because it's a consistent metric, you can see if you've actually improved or not. So would you plug any of that into any sort of part of CI process? Can you plug it in that way, or is it more you'd use a library as part of that? I haven't heard of it being plugged in, but I imagine you could. Obviously the common one is web page test, isn't it? Yes. Which I think we know some people that work there, but yeah, they were the go-to, weren't they? And I think it's actually really flexible in terms of you can actually ship your own performance tests to them and they'll run them for you, and they can run from different regions. Right. That's like the daddy version, isn't it? The grown-up version of it. Yeah. I think that's, plugging things into your automation setup is a huge part of making sure it sticks as well. So I know I've kind of mentioned this a little bit in the past, but reducing that friction from a dev point of view to make sure that you stick to it. So, having dashboards of Lighthouse metrics and, APM tool metrics there to show when you deviate from an acceptable level is a huge part of team culture, I think, too. Yeah, absolutely. I think, once you've identified these problems, you need to surface them often and actually monitor the difference between them. And then you can get on to actually fixing some of these issues. Once you've got this good baseline, you've tested it in web.dev or whatever tools, you've got your application performance monitoring set up. You know what's on fire and what isn't. You can start then planning out, right, what do we attack? And it is diminishing returns. You might find that you can spend a few days on the front end performance, and then you hit a roadblock where you just I've spent another hour and I've only shaved off a millisecond. There's a point where you can just stop. But you can do things like you've obviously got all the next gen image formats. So a quick way to do that would be use something like Cloudinary. Obviously be mindful of cost because it can be quite spenny. And obviously defer lazy loading, things like that. I think that the kind of image format journey on the web has been a really interesting one. I remember when we started doing these events in 2013, there was Dom and Ed, who created Resource It, which was a really, at the time, a completely game-changing service to on the fly, convert and crop and resize and optimize images. Which got bought by Fastly, so I should really be plugging Fastly here. Fastly have an amazing image resizing service. We are open to sponsorship if you're interested. But so I think that was a really interesting point where, with very little effort from the engineering side, you could then get, an optimized set of images for
not just for for desktop. It was we could optimize for devices and all sorts.
The reason you should give that to someone else to do is because it is way more complex than you think it is.
Yeah,
and you need to generate so many different variants because each browser supports different things. Different versions of browsers support different things,
and also just maintaining those formats and how do you expire them. And we should get Dom and Ed on really to have but yeah, I imagine it is quite a complex problem.
Mine's greater than ours working on this.
Yeah, definitely. But yes, please carry on.
But from my point of view, put script in, image go small. And that's how you want it to be, really. And
there's that's the thing as well. Obviously, you do have costs to bear in mind, but there's absolutely no shame from using services like that can help you get something to market quicker and probably solve problems a lot better than, it's like the crypto conversation we had in the last podcast. Yeah. Probably just don't touch it, just use a service or a library for it.
Yeah, and they'll keep it updated and keep improving it for you, so you don't have to keep up with the latest and greatest.
Yeah.
And you can put all this image resize stuff in your Webpack or whatever pipeline, but it really, really whizzes up the fans on my computer. And you seem to be like, I don't know if you find this when you jump on random projects, but it feels like you're just always compressing images. if it does get, it's like the cache always never really works properly, maybe. Or maybe I'm doing something wrong.
Well, I think most of them under the hood just use image magic on your system. And that's probably why the fans are spinning. But yeah. So there's a conversation going on at the moment around, we got into the habit of compressing everything into a single bundle, and then the bundles got quite large with a lot of JavaScript, a lot of other libraries, and now there's a conversation going on. Well, a lot of the technologies have kind of progressed a bit since then. Loading multiple files at the same time is now a lot more efficient. Where's your head at with that?
Yeah, so we were meant to get the improvements with HTTP2, but it didn't really work in the end, did it?
No.
So it's Quick QUIC, which is baked into Google Chrome for quite a while, and they were using it. It's basically HTTP over UDP.
Right.
So UDP is where you send a packet and you don't necessarily need a response.
Yeah.
So at the application level, it figures out redelivery and actually figuring out the size of packets and how often they're sent and things like that. So the application can control all that, which is loads faster than the TCP stack, basically. I mean, I don't understand how it works, just that I know enough to be dangerous, but I think it's really clever. And I guess the end goal for the web is to make it as simple as possible to just load files as if they were just files when you need them, rather than everything all bundled up. So we're going to have to actually start undoing some of the best practices we learned, similar as we did with CSS, with CSS and Garden, and put semantic classes on everything. I'm going to get some hate for those comments because I don't think everyone's on board with Tailwind CSS yet, but
there's been some Twitter fire. Days since last Twitter argument is always zero, but
that's it. But I do think we learned some best practices that have probably turned out to be less than good. And the thing is, you got to remember everything's always evolving.
Yeah,
and there are different reasons to do things.
I think the intent of that bundling was great, obviously, and it did work for a long time. But then, the complexity of what we were putting in libraries and the footprint of that was becoming quite a lot. And also a lot of the, when you have a large bundle that might contain, let's say, 100 files, if only one of them changes, to invalidate the entire bundle and redownload the whole lot is quite an expensive operation for the user.
Absolutely. And if you're running a large web application, do you really want users waiting for your whole app to load while they're sat on the login screen?
Yeah.
Or do you want to really quickly render the login screen and while they're logging in, go and fetch all that stuff for them?
Yeah.
Because they don't know what the password is, or they need to click on the thing for their password manager.
It takes a while.
Or do forgotten password process because they've got loads of them. During that time, you can download half a gig's worth of JavaScript if you really want.
Yeah.
Don't do that, but you could do.
And the laptop crashes. Yeah, I think that's, a lot of the newer libraries have definitely started to do the eager loading on the front end. So you hover over a link, it already prefetches the page content, things like that, we can start to become a lot more efficient with.
Yeah, definitely. And some parts of your application, like let's say it generates a PDF or it does something less common, you could just load the script that does that.
Yeah.
Using the sort of normal module format in JavaScript now, because there's been so many different ones, AMD, CommonJS, all this stuff. But now you can I think you just do a regular import between.
You see that as well with the workers, don't you? So you see a lot of that happening. So some pages load in the worker related scripts and data just in time. Because you said you don't want to be downloading half a gig.
Yeah, that's it. I think a lot of code bases out there will always be transpiling as well. It's like with Babel and things like that. And we're going to have to slowly unpeel that. Or at least, I think you can set in your config, like all evergreen and last X of these, but just it's worth checking those. Because if you go too far back, it's trying to polyfill like really large JavaScript features into IE9, and your customers aren't using IE9, or the rest of your application doesn't even work on IE9, but you're transpiling it for that.
It's a really good point, that in terms of what is your browser support matrix? Is it as generous as some of these polyfills and everything are needed for, or
Yeah, because you got to look at like Google Docs and even Microsoft themselves dropping support for sort of IE and stuff.
Yeah.
Office 365 Online, I don't think that fully works in IE9.
No.
So if you're still transpiling for that, just probably stop. Unless you have some really strange use case, which I think a lot of people unfortunately do sometimes.
Yeah.
But
especially if you're working in the in
corporate environment,
corporate or public contracts and things like that,
which I guess is where a lot of software exists.
I think the sad thing about that is I'm going to have to open that Webpack config and actually understand what it means.
Oh no, I'll assign that to someone else.
Will not fix.
Webpack confuses me, but it does seem to be what everyone's using.
Yeah, again, it's very easy to mock tooling, but a lot of energy and effort and goodwill's gone into making the ecosystem a really good place. So it's only in jest. And
there's Parcel and Vite and all the others which are out there to simplify this. But I think if everyone has their own build tools, then it's going to get even more confusing.
It makes it really hard when you go to a new project and you're like, it takes you a while to get your head, no matter how well documented it is.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. What's your view on deferred and lazy loading?
I think if you can do it. Some third-party scripts break when you do it. So you need to double check. But by and large, I think Google Tag Manager has a thing where it can actually help scripts that are written in a bad way.
Right.
So a lot of scripts will do document.write, and I think it can do some magic.
Oh, right.
Where it wraps that somehow.
So why do some things break? Because of deferred and lazy loading?
Because they're expected to be in the head and they want to get their stuff done before anything else loads in the page.
Right.
So if that's setting up some sort of variable that everything can access, so you can push analytics data into it, or let's say you're a tracking pixel thing and you're on a contact confirmation page and it runs a function and it calls something in the head and it gets a bit messy.
So it relies on quite a linear call stack or quite a linear set of operations to happen.
Google Analytics get around this by having it's just a variable, which is an array, and you push stuff onto it, and then when the script finally loads, it just pulls things off that. It
pops it off and then it replaces the implementation of push. So push then directly does the actual call, doesn't it?
That's good. That's clever.
I did really like that.
If more third parties did stuff like that, it would be really good. And ideally, just reduce the number of third party scripts. If you can convince the product owner or customer or whoever, you don't necessarily want to put 3 different kinds of tracking and add stuff, and because it does really slow down the page.
It really does. I've started to take because I think as well with some of the analytics stuff, obviously analytics are important, and really understanding the metrics of your applications are really huge, as well as especially when you're looking at like user journeys and tracking what people are doing. But there's also a negative side to that, which is you probably shouldn't be doing that from a privacy point of view. Also, some of it's, or a lot of it is actually vanity related, you know?
Yeah.
You just want to know how many people are visiting certain bits of content, and is it important? Are you using that data for good?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think some companies, I think you can do it in Segment and others, you can actually do server-side tracking.
Yeah.
So how many visitors you've got and where they're going, you can track that from the server end, and then you don't have to put cookies on people's computers and follow them around the internet.
Yeah, I think Netlify and quite a few others have implemented all the server-side stuff. You just switch it on. It's generic tracking in terms of that it's not
user like identifiable information and stuff like that. I scrub the IPs out and user agents maybe,
which is great, right?
Yeah, that's what you want. Just get the data you need and no more. But I think a lot of tools, their default is let's get everything. Let's get a big net and trudge up half the sea and then sift through it, which makes sense for their business model because they don't know what you're going to ask them for later. Yeah. But if you can plan out, I need these metrics, then just collect those. And do you think that, so with a tool like New Relic, do you feel like they are overly generous in their collection, or do you think it's about right? Or so what they do is they actually scrub the values out of things like SQL queries, and you don't get things like post data and stuff like that. So I think that's about right. Yeah, that's just enough to debug the problem. Yeah, and I think there is ways to scrub more if you can. That's one to be careful with as well, especially if you're working in regulated industries where you've got to be, obviously you should always be careful with PII, but you should be especially careful in those scenarios. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So in terms of kind of preloading, caching of static assets and things like that, do we still need to be conscious of that? Do we need to, because we talked about the bundles, possibly working back from that and loading resources separately. Caching strategies for things like that, do we still need to be, fingerprinting file names to make sure that we can invalidate caches easily? Where are we at with that? Yeah, I go back and forward on this quite a bit. I think putting the hashes in the file names is really good in a lot of instances where you're moving all those files to a CDN. Yeah. If you're serving them from an application and you have blue-green deployments with a cache layer in front, it can cause you quite a few headaches. Yeah. Because you might grab the first request from the old deploy and then try and grab the asset from the next one. So there's a window of no CSS, so no JS, no, because it's pointing to a file that's no longer there because it can't be served out of that pod anymore. Yeah. So you have to move all the assets to S3 and so it's CDN, which is probably sensible anyway. I think you can also just give this problem to someone else, like Cloudflare. Yeah. And they will have sensible defaults. You put it in front of stuff. You go, right, these are static assets, mostly static. And they will manage all that for you with all the E tags and bits and pieces. Huge fan of Cloudflare. I think it's such a amazing tool chain. I mean, they've just launched an S3 killer, haven't they? I can't remember what it's called. Oh, have they? I must have missed that. Is it R2 or something like that? Oh, right. But it looks absolutely amazing because they've found a way to incrementally roll it out so you can put it in front of your S3 bucket and it'll go there first, and if it doesn't exist it'll fetch it from S3 and bring it into the Cloudflare once and then keep it there forever, because the thing about S3 is the cost out of S3 is extraordinary. And I think Cloudflare, it's so much cheaper. It's an absolute game changer, really. That's really clever of them in terms of a migration strategy as well, because it just kind of works when the requests hit 0 on S3. That's it. And their API is S3 compatible, so you can plug your existing app into it and write directly there if you want to. I do wonder whether we're going to be moving more towards a world of really compatible services regardless of the vendor. So you see a lot of that with
with document databases, like Mongo compatible layer, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense because if the API is pretty good, and loads of stuff uses it, the thing is, I reckon S3 have added so many features over the years. If you've ended up using some of those, you might struggle a bit, which I guess is why Cloudflare have gone down this. You could use both route,
and they rarely deprecate anything. So
yeah. But yeah, I think definitely look at Cloudflare. You can switch on some magic switches in there, and it'll make stuff faster.
I think the defaults are, as you said, quite good. Speaking of resource it earlier, we used Cloudflare for some of the Lad Bible content.
Oh, right,
So for some of the video content, automatic resizing and scaling based on devices and of videos. So you'd have a single submission file and it'd do a lot of the cropping and everything for you.
Oh, amazing.
Cloudflare's service for that is super, super good, super fast.
Amazing.
Fastly
also have a really cool feature called stale while revalidate, but implemented at the CDN level. So when people visit your site, you will always get one out of cache until that cache expires. And what you'll often see is that'll be implemented as one long slow request for that one user, and they'll get unlucky, or those users that back up into that time frame. Whereas what this does is it'll still serve them a stale one, but in the background it'll go get a fresh copy.
Yeah, that's great.
And then update the cache, so no one ever gets a slow request. And it also hides downtime for static pages. Your app, if people logged into your app, obviously they'll know, but it's stale while revalidate is really, really clever.
It's that kind of same mindset as the out of process processing, I guess. I love that kind of pattern, especially when it comes to kind of application performance.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that, Josh. I think we covered quite a few areas. Obviously, there's still tons more to talk about in terms of front-end performance, but I think we've covered a few interesting topics. Do check out a few of our other episodes online, and we'll see you next time.